For an avoidant person, silence can often feel like the exact thing they crave most in the world. When a relationship feels overwhelming, when intimacy feels suffocating, when too many emotions come at them all at once, their natural instinct is to retreat and to carve out distance. So, in the beginning, when the anxious partner finally decides to stop reaching out, stop calling, stop sending those messages of reassurance, the avoidant interprets this silence as a gift. They tell themselves this is what they wanted all along. This is the space they have been needing. This is the air they can finally breathe without someone else trying to pull them closer than they feel comfortable. At first, they even feel powerful because it seems like their strategy worked, their partner backed away, and they no longer have to explain, justify, or manage closeness. To the avoidant, those first moments of silence seem like freedom. They feel calm, almost relieved, as if the pressure has been lifted and the problem has been solved simply because the anxious partner went quiet. But silence is not static, and what feels like peace in the beginning does not always remain that way over time. Once the hours pass, and then the days stretch further than expected, something subtle begins to shift beneath the avoidant's initial relief. The absence that once felt like liberation starts to feel unfamiliar, and instead of a breath of fresh air, it starts to carry a hint of emptiness. The avoidant begins to notice that the texts they assumed would eventually come are not arriving. The reassurance they believed was guaranteed is no longer filling the silence, and the calls they thought they could ignore are not even being made anymore. Their sense of control begins to waver because in their mind they had predicted the silence would be temporary, that eventually the anxious partner would return just as always, picking up the pieces and restoring the cycle. When that does not happen on schedule, the avoidant starts to feel something they did not expect, an unease creeping into what was once a comforting quiet, a sense that maybe they are not the one orchestrating the distance anymore. This realization is unsettling because avoidants rely on the predictability of the anxious partner's persistence. They are used to the dynamic where one person pursues and the other pulls away. And in that dance, they always felt secure knowing that no matter how far they retreated, the anxious partner would bridge the gap. When silence lingers longer than expected, that pattern breaks, and suddenly the avoidant is not sure what comes next. The power they thought they held starts slipping, and with it comes an unexpected wave of doubt. They may not admit it, but the thought begins to rise that maybe the anxious partner has truly stepped back. Maybe this silence is not temporary but permanent, and maybe they are experiencing the first signs of abandonment rather than relief. This is when the inner dialogue changes, because the avoidant begins to question their choices, to wonder if they pushed too hard, withdrew too quickly, or demanded too much space without realizing the cost. The freedom that once seemed so appealing begins to transform into the possibility of loss, and that fear shakes their sense of safety in the dynamic. The silence continues to grow louder with each passing day, and instead of being filled with calm, it becomes filled with discomfort, tension, and even panic. The avoidant starts to feel exposed because they can no longer hide behind the comfort of knowing someone else will always step forward. They are forced to sit with themselves in a space that was never meant to last this long. What started as a quiet victory feels more like an unfamiliar vulnerability, and the avoidant finds themselves thinking about the anxious partner far more than they expected to. Every hour that goes by without a message or a call deepens the sense that something has shifted beyond their control. And that realization is shocking because for the first time, they are not the one dictating the pace of closeness or distance. They are caught between wanting the silence to continue and desperately wishing for it to end, between enjoying the space and fearing that the space might become permanent. And that inner conflict is what makes the prolonged silence so powerful. When the anxious partner stays silent longer than expected, one of the first things that happens to the avoidant is that their sense of control begins to erode in ways they never anticipated. For so long, they believed they were steering the dynamic by being the one to pull back, to retreat, to put space between themselves and the relationship. That role gave them a sense of safety because it allowed them to decide how much closeness was too much and when they needed to withdraw. But when the silence continues past the time they predicted, they realize they are no longer the one in charge of the rhythm. It dawns on them that they cannot predict when or if the other person will return, and this is deeply unsettling because control has always been the mechanism that kept them feeling safe. Without control, the balance shifts, and with it, their entire sense of security in the relationship. At first, they might dismiss the silence as a temporary pause, telling themselves it is only a matter of time before the anxious partner cracks and makes contact again. They may even double down on their certainty, believing the pattern will continue as it always has. But as each day passes without the usual reassurance, that certainty starts to weaken. What they once thought was guaranteed no longer feels reliable. The avoidant notices that the expected text never appears, that the social media interaction they were sure would pop up hasn't happened, that the lifeline they always counted on has quietly disappeared. This gradual realization chips away at their confidence and replaces it with a growing discomfort. The longer the silence stretches, the more they begin to understand that the anxious partner is no longer playing their usual role, and that recognition feels like the ground shifting beneath their feet. For someone who thrives on predictability, this lack of response becomes an unpredictable storm. They find themselves questioning not only the present, but also the past, wondering if they missed signs that the anxious partner was preparing to stop chasing, wondering if they ignored the depth of the frustration or the exhaustion that might have led to this silence. These questions stir up unease because avoidants typically avoid introspection that challenges their behavior. Yet now they are confronted with the possibility that their retreat pushed too far. Their mind starts to loop through possibilities, imagining different scenarios of what the silence means, and each imagined scenario leaves them feeling more unsettled than the last. They cannot tell if the silence is a temporary test, a permanent goodbye, or a sign that their partner has begun to detach for good. The uncertainty gnaws at them, and it begins to feel heavier than the closeness they were once trying to escape. The more they realize they are not in control, the stronger the emotional undercurrent becomes. They may find themselves checking their phone even when they told themselves they would not, scrolling through conversations to see the last message exchanged, or replaying interactions in their mind to figure out what triggered this shift. Small things they once ignored suddenly take on huge meaning, like whether the anxious partner viewed their story, whether they liked a photo, or whether they disappeared completely. This hyper-awareness grows because the avoidant is no longer receiving the regular signals they depended on, and without those signals, they feel unanchored. The illusion of control they once had collapses into a need for reassurance they cannot ask for without breaking their role in the dynamic. This tension between wanting control and realizing they no longer have it leaves them stuck in a loop of unease and quiet panic. What makes this loss of control so powerful is that it forces the avoidant into unfamiliar emotional territory. They are no longer dictating the pace, no longer managing the space, no longer deciding when intimacy resumes. Instead, they are left waiting, wondering, and sitting in the discomfort of someone else's decision. For someone used to calling the shots by withdrawing, this reversal is both shocking and destabilizing. It confronts them with the reality that their partner is not as dependent as they assumed, and that silence can hold more power than words. It leaves them in a space where their usual strategies no longer work, where the dynamic has been interrupted, and where the rules they relied on no longer apply. When the anxious partner finally stops reaching out and allows the silence to stretch far beyond what the avoidant ever anticipated, something very important begins to surface inside the avoidant, and that is the flood of hidden fears and insecurities that have been buried beneath the surface for so long. For years, they may have lived with the comfort of knowing that no matter how far they withdrew, no matter how cold they became, the anxious partner would always close the gap, always be the one to reach across the silence and restore the connection. That certainty allowed them to avoid confronting their own vulnerabilities, because they never had to sit with the question of whether they were truly loved or whether they might be left behind. When the silence remains unbroken, that shield collapses, and the avoidant is forced into an unfamiliar confrontation with emotions they worked hard to suppress. At first, these insecurities appear in subtle ways: a restless feeling, an unexplained frustration, an underlying tension that something is not right. The avoidant may notice themselves becoming distracted by thoughts of the anxious partner, replaying old moments, wondering what they are doing and who they might be with. They may try to dismiss these thoughts, telling themselves that they do not care, but the silence keeps proving otherwise. Every hour without a message deepens the discomfort, and each day without contact pushes their insecurities closer to the surface. The avoidant, who once found safety in distance, now begins to feel abandoned by the very distance they created. This is when their inner fears start to whisper questions they would rather not face, like whether they are lovable enough, whether they are worth fighting for, and whether their pattern of withdrawal has finally cost them the person who always provided reassurance. As the silence continues, those questions no longer remain whispers. They grow louder, echoing inside the avoidant's mind until they can no longer be ignored. The fear of rejection begins to take hold, and with it comes the anxiety of losing the person they thought would never leave. They might not admit it outwardly, because avoidants are skilled at appearing unaffected, but inside they start to experience moments of panic. They scan for signs of life, hoping for a notification, hoping for any proof that the anxious partner is still tethered to them, but when those signs do not come, their insecurities tighten their grip. The absence becomes a mirror reflecting back their deepest fears, the fear of not being enough, the fear of being replaceable, and the fear of being unworthy of lasting love. These feelings were always there, buried under the cycle of chase and retreat, but only in silence do they become impossible to ignore. The irony is that the avoidant believed silence would protect them, but now it exposes them. Instead of feeling free, they feel vulnerable. Instead of feeling in control, they feel lost. The insecurities they worked so hard to outrun catch up to them in the quiet. They start to question whether the anxious partner has moved on, whether they are seeking comfort elsewhere, or whether they have finally learned to live without them. Each possibility intensifies their fears because the one thing the avoidant relied on was the anxious person's consistency, and now that consistency is gone. With no one rushing in to soothe their doubts, those insecurities spiral unchecked, creating a storm of emotion they cannot suppress as easily as they used to. This is the shocking reality that prolonged silence brings. It is not just an absence of words, but the arrival of every hidden fear the avoidant thought they had managed to bury. The silence strips away their defenses and leaves them face to face with insecurities that have been silently shaping their behavior all along. The avoidant starts to see that beneath their desire for distance lies a fear of abandonment. Beneath their push for independence lies a fear of rejection. And beneath their cool exterior lies a longing for connection they are terrified to admit. The longer the silence lasts, the louder these truths become. And no matter how much they try to deny them, the avoidant is confronted with the reality that their hidden fears have always been waiting for this exact moment to surface. When the anxious partner goes silent and breaks the pattern that both people have unconsciously relied on, the dynamic of chase and retreat begins to collapse. And this is one of the most disorienting experiences for an avoidant. They have lived in a rhythm where they withdraw and the anxious person pursues, where every step back is met with a step forward, where their retreat is validated by the other person's effort to close the gap. This has given the avoidant a sense of stability because even when they pulled away, they could predict the anxious partner's next move, and that predictability kept the cycle alive. But when silence extends beyond what they expected, the cycle suddenly halts. The rules change, and the avoidant finds themselves in uncharted territory where the roles they have depended on no longer exist. The pursuer has stopped pursuing, and without that, the avoidant is left in a place they never prepared for. At first, the avoidant may try to rationalize the shift, convincing themselves that it is temporary and that the anxious partner will eventually return to their usual role. They tell themselves this is just a pause, just a test, and soon the dynamic will resume as normal. But as the days go by and no effort is made to restore the connection, the avoidant begins to realize that the old rhythm has been disrupted in a way that may not be reversible. This realization is profoundly unsettling because the chase was not just about reassurance for the anxious partner, it was also a form of reassurance for the avoidant. As long as they were chased, they could believe they were desired. They could believe that no matter how far they retreated, they were still valuable enough to be pursued. Without the chase, that validation disappears, and they are forced to question what it means when no one comes after them anymore. The disruption of this dynamic also reveals how much the avoidant relied on it to regulate their own emotions. Even though they resented the pressure of being pursued, they simultaneously needed it to feel secure in the relationship. It created a strange balance where their withdrawal was always met with proof of the other person's commitment, and in that proof they found an unspoken safety. Now, with silence stretching on, that safety evaporates. Instead of feeling comforted by space, the avoidant begins to feel the weight of uncertainty pressing in because without pursuit there is no longer evidence of commitment. The avoidant must now confront the possibility that the anxious partner's silence is not a temporary break, but a signal of independence, a sign that they are no longer willing to play their role in the cycle. This forces the avoidant to recognize that the dynamic they thought they could control was actually a fragile system, dependent on the other person's willingness to participate. As the days of silence turn into weeks, the avoidant is left grappling with the unfamiliar discomfort of being on the other side of the pattern. They are no longer the one dictating the terms of closeness and distance. They are no longer in charge of when reconnection happens, and this reversal leaves them unsettled. For the first time, they experience what it feels like to wait, to hope, to anticipate the other person's move, and that role reversal creates a shock that shakes their usual defenses. They may find themselves longing for the anxious partner to break the silence, not because they want closeness, but because they want the comfort of knowing the game is still being played. The absence of the chase reveals how dependent they were on it, and how much their identity in the relationship was tied to being the one who retreated while still being desired. This breakdown of the chase and retreat dynamic is more than just a shift in behavior. It is a complete dismantling of the framework the avoidant has relied on to feel secure. It forces them into a vulnerable position where they must confront the possibility that they are not as indispensable as they once believed, that the person who always pursued them might now be capable of walking away, and that silence may not be a temporary interruption but a permanent change. The avoidant is left feeling destabilized because the dynamic that gave them both control and validation has been stripped away, leaving them with nothing to fall back on except their own uncomfortable emotions. When the anxious partner maintains silence longer than the avoidant ever believed possible, the effect is not only the breakdown of control and disruption of patterns, it is also the moment when the avoidant is forced to sit with emotions they have been running from their entire lives. Avoidants have mastered the art of distraction, creating space whenever intimacy feels overwhelming, pulling away whenever connection feels threatening, and convincing themselves that independence is safer than closeness. But when silence stretches on, and there is no one to fill the gap with reassurance or pursuit, the very feelings they sought to escape rise to the surface with full force. The loneliness they tried to deny, the longing they tried to bury, the fears they worked hard to suppress all come flooding back into their awareness, and without the anxious partner chasing after them, there is no shield left to hide behind. In this silence, the avoidant begins to realize that space is not just freedom, but also emptiness, and that emptiness cannot be filled by distraction forever. What once felt like relief begins to feel like isolation, and isolation carries with it a mirror they cannot escape. It reflects back the truth that distance does not eliminate the need for connection. It only delays the confrontation with it. They begin to feel the weight of their own choices, the cost of repeatedly pushing away the very person who offered closeness, and the ache of wondering whether they might have sabotaged something irreplaceable. This emotional reckoning is uncomfortable because avoidants prefer to numb, to avoid, to run. But silence has a way of stripping away those defenses and leaving them face to face with the raw reality they would rather deny. The longer the silence continues, the more those buried emotions intensify. Fear turns into anxiety. Anxiety turns into restlessness, and restlessness begins to morph into a kind of desperation they cannot easily explain. They may try to convince themselves they are fine, that this is what they wanted, that solitude is safer, but their inner dialogue betrays them. They start questioning whether the anxious partner has truly let go, whether the silence means the end of the connection, and whether they will ever experience the comfort of being desired again. Each unanswered question creates a deeper pull into emotions they avoided for years, forcing them to acknowledge that beneath all their defenses lies a very real desire for love, acceptance, and reassurance. The very silence they thought would protect them instead exposes their deepest vulnerability, leaving them raw and unsettled. This forced confrontation with emotion also reveals the fragility of the avoidance strategies. They discover that withdrawing does not eliminate their need for closeness, it only postpones the inevitable confrontation with it. By pushing away, they assumed they could control intimacy, but now they see that control is an illusion because emotions are not eliminated by silence, they are amplified by it. The anxious partner's withdrawal shines a spotlight on this truth, making it impossible for the avoidant to continue denying that they too crave connection. The more they sit in the quiet, the more they recognize the emptiness inside themselves, and the more they begin to understand that running has only left them feeling more lost, not more free. In the end, the silence that lasts longer than expected becomes a teacher, one that forces the avoidant to experience emotions they have spent a lifetime avoiding. It strips away the distractions, the defenses, and the dynamics they relied on, leaving them with nothing but the truth of their own feelings. That truth is uncomfortable, even painful, because it reveals how much of their behavior was rooted in fear rather than strength, in avoidance rather than authenticity, in retreat rather than genuine independence. And when those emotions rise to the surface with nowhere else to go, the avoidant is confronted with the very thing they have resisted most, the undeniable reality of their own vulnerability.